federal judge has just dismissed a major felony charge, well, two of them, I should say specifically, against two former Louisville police officers. Now, interesting enough, that judge has also ruled that Breonna Taylor's boyfriend is the reason why she was killed that night and not police. Now, that ruling obviously not getting enough media attention, of course, because, well, the 2020 BLM riots were largely due to the disinformation that was put out by the mainstream media, as well as those on the left. But again, this federal U.S. District Judge, Judge Charles Sampson, now saying that Taylor's boyfriend was the one responsible. His name is Kenneth Walker. Now, again, folks, Kenneth Walker did open fire on law enforcement when they did announce their presence outside the apartment. And in exchange, they had obviously returned fire, and that is how Miss Taylor did pass away. And it's extremely unfortunate, of course, because Breonna Taylor did not have to die that night. If her boyfriend would have listened to police as they announced that they were outside her apartment, this wouldn't have happened. But it wasn't just Taylor who was shot that day. There was also a police officer who was shot that day. And he joins me now. Please welcome to the show, Sergeant John Mattingly. John Mattingly, thank you for jumping on with us. I greatly appreciate it. I wanted to talk to you directly about this because, well, the judge has now ruled that Breonna Taylor's boyfriend, Kenneth Walker, is the one who's responsible for her death and not police officers. Now, obviously, Kenneth Walker, like I mentioned, did shoot you. And that's the reason why Taylor is no longer with us, because police did return fire. So your reaction to the federal judge's ruling?
Well, I mean, it's something I've been saying since day one. You know, my very first TV interview was on 2020 and Good Morning America with Michael Strahan. And when I laid it out this way, you know, I got a gasp from Strahan, and then the host the next morning beat me up over it, saying, well, it's not, you know, Kenneth's fault. And I'm like, well, what kind of man thinks he's getting broken into, brings his girlfriend into the hall, has a minute to prepare, get dressed, get a gun, stand and wait, bring her with, doesn't have her wait back and call 911. He doesn't call 911 because all the media coverage you saw from the national media played the 911 tape that he actually called 6.5 minutes after the tragic incident occurred. So it's not like we were at the door banging and he didn't know who it was and he called 911. No, they got out of bed. He brought her with him. Then once we came through the door and we were all announcing police at this point, he shot me and then he dove into a doorway, leaving her in the hallway. And she attempted to follow him in, and that's when she was struck, unfortunately. And tragically, and it's horrible. And you're right, Breonna didn't deserve to die. But then the amazing thing is when he finally came out of the apartment 17 minutes later, he blamed Breonna for shooting.
Yes.
So then he put the blame on her. So, you know, he was a coward from day one, and I've called it. And I'm finally glad someone in the judicial system had the courage to look at the facts and say, this is the actual cause of death. Now, none of the actions, you know, everything went sideways. Nobody can say it didn't. But the fact that had he not pulled the trigger, we would never had to return fire. And no police officer wants to return fire. No police officer wants to kill anybody. But when you're pinned in a corner, you've got to do something to stay alive.
Yeah, and you detailed all of this in your book, 12 Seconds in the Dark, a police officer's firsthand account of what the Breonna Taylor raid really was. And it's a great read, and I highly recommend our audience getting it. It's actually right behind me, my bookshelf. Most of you guys can see it when my shot's full. It's a great read, and I highly recommend our audience go give that a look, because it pretty much debunks the narrative that's been spun by the mainstream media. As many of you guys know, this happened during a presidential election year. And so, of course, unfortunately, they used this and they played this up into their favor because those on the left were able to sit there and say that, you know, law enforcement, it was the cause of Breonna's death, and it wasn't, in fact, her boyfriend. And so for so long, it took us over 4 years to get to this point. Now we know for a fact that her boyfriend was the reason for all of this. And like you said, because of a brave judge, someone willing to step up and tell the truth on this issue, because so many people were not. I want to talk about, though, there were so many people who were not telling the truth about the raid. And I wanted you to detail that for our audience. Now, I know members of the Louisville Police Department have been heavily criticized for their response in all of this, even being accused of falsifying the warrant that was executed on her home. And then after all of that, there was a lot of blame that was shifted around to several officers involved and even to yourself. So detail for our audience that this wasn't just the mainstream media kind of shifting blame. It also happened internally within the police department.
Yeah, unfortunately, and I have the privilege now of traveling around the country, sharing my story, talking to leaders, and hopefully make some changes. And one of the main things we talk about is transparency. Greg Fisher, who was our mayor at the time, that was his big quote: transparency, transparency. But that was never the case in the city of Louisville. Anybody that lives there and paid any attention knows that's the truth. And when this happened, we begged for transparency as officers, the ones involved. We begged the command staff, the mayor's office for transparency. And their whole pushback was, well, we can't set precedent for future cases, meaning they did not want to debunk any of the lies that were coming in, saying we had the wrong apartment, saying she was asleep in bed, the boyfriend was in custody, nothing was found. All those lies. They never pushed back on them. And we know the reason why, because the mayor's office was deeply involved in this through all the gentrification. So you can blame Kenneth Walker on scene for the death of Breonna Taylor. But if you want to talk about the people who got the cog in motion, the wheels moving, it's the mayor's office with all the degentrification and coming in and basically trying to take areas of the community to make them better ultimately in the end, but doing it the wrong way. So when that was out, that's the main thing, is the lies that were not debunked. And I don't understand why departments don't do it. And since we're talking about that, I had a lot of people reach out to me saying, congratulations, this is a win for you all. And I'm sitting back going, well, it is, but it's not. Because if you look at the entire crux of this thing, as far as those officers that put the misleading line in the warrant. Now, what they said was factually true, but the way they stated it was wrong. He was receiving packages at Breonna's apartment. They've got videos and photos of him going in empty-handed, coming out, going to the trap house with them. They have her taking him to the trap house. But
are you referring to Kenneth Walker or the other boyfriend?
I'm referring to, this is Jamarcus Glover. Right.
Okay.
So you kind of had two boyfriends at the same time running parallel, doing illegal things. So, you lay with dogs, you get fleas sometimes. That's just the way it is. And in this situation, we're talking about the other boyfriend because the warrant is what was at play here. This is what the judge is talking about, that the fact that this warrant may have had a line in it that was inaccurate or lie or false, or however you want to phrase it, was the leading cause of her death. He said, no, it's the actions of Kenneth Walker. But to be transparent, to be honest, like I preach, then you've got to go back and say, those guys did put a line in that warrant that was factually incorrect. Now, theoretically, it was correct because he was getting packages, but the factual part, they worded it wrong, saying the postmaster stated that he was getting packages there when he didn't. The postmaster never said that. So, but the Supreme Court has said, if you take the total, all the probable cause in the warrant, and you put it together, even if you have to take that line out, if a probable cause is good in the warrant's still valid. And that night, obviously, a judge signed it. It was valid for us to serve. If you go back into court now, they'll have to decide whether, once you pull that line out, if all the other probable cause being his address was there, his car was registered there, his bank account, his license. She bailed him out 2 months prior and said that was his address. So all the totality of the circumstances says that the warrant would have been valid even with that line out. But again, I just want to be transparent because that was the cause of this. This isn't clearing everybody. The guy who shot through the windows is still facing trial in October. They're still going to have to face trial for their lies. But I'm glad at least someone said, hey, despite all that, the fact that Breonna's dead is the cause of her boyfriend.
Yeah. Well, I'm proud of the judge for admitting that. I'm also proud of you for saying that, because very rarely do people kind of come forward and honestly say, some people here did give misleading statements. And although we know that from this judge's ruling as well, it's kind of refreshing to hear you echo that. Because again, there is blame in this situation to be tossed around. Although I think the bulk of the death is to her boyfriend, unfortunately. Again, this was all executed, and we're going to go over this in just a second, as they call, the no-knock warrant, which was extremely misleading to those in the media who are pushing for it. But I just want to remind our audience as to what this judge's ruling really means. It means that the maximum sentence of life in prison is no longer on the table, that instead is all bumped down to misdemeanor offenses, is from what I've read into all of this. And so that's really what this judge's ruling means, that this is no longer, like, they charge them with conspiracy. That charge is now gone. And so this has kind of wiped them of a lot of the severity of what was initially charged here. But I want to talk, John, about the no-knock warrant, because the media was very misleading in what a no-knock warrant is. Now, it's my understanding from those in law enforcement that I asked at the time that no-knock warrants are given out to a lot of people in law enforcement, but it's up to the officers or whoever's serving the warrant whether they're going to use that or not. And they could use it if it's in a dangerous situation where they do feel like either their lives are at risk if they do knock, or evidence might be flushed to that kind of extent. So explain to our audience, what is a no-knock warrant, and explain to our audience why you guys decided to announce that you guys were outside of her apartment that day instead of going with a no-knock that you were granted access to do.
Right. So a no knock warrant is basically a judge gives you permission based on the total circumstances. And most of it's, we had a checklist of stuff that had to go through. You know, they had to be violent felon offenders in the past with a history of maybe assaulting the police, of having guard dogs, maybe cameras, security, different type things like that. So once that was established and they got it approved by a judge, then you can go up and you can just simply go and ram the door or bust through the door. And then you're going through announce police, but it gives you that time advantage, which is critical in certain situations, mainly in situations like when there's a hostage on the other side of that door, or when there's maybe some child porn that can get destroyed through a computer. Those are the type times you really want to utilize those, not really for drugs. There's time and place for it. I think this time they probably, in my opinion, should not have done it for the drugs. But I'm not the one who signed off on it. The judge did. So she obviously saw there was enough there, and there was enough there for what it amounts to and what they're allowed to do. But that night when I showed up, I remember seeing on the board, no knock, no knock. And then under the one we were going to do, knock and announce. And I said, why is this a knock and announce? And they said, well, it no longer fits the parameters. You know, Glover, we know exactly where he's going to be. We got a tracker on his car, ping on his phone, poll cams on the locations. We know he's going to be on Elliott, not at Breonna's place. So they did the right thing in calling this off as a no-knock because it didn't fit the parameters. So that was the correct call to make on this situation. And that's what we did. You know, we gave her a minute to come to the door with knocking and announcing. It's unfortunate that, you know, originally the courts believed that these criminals who live in an environment of lies, as opposed to 7 police officers with about 140 years experience.
Yeah, yeah, and just to echo that, there were witnesses who did say that they heard you guys announcing your arrival at her apartment, and so it debunks what the media has been putting out there. Because again, they all led with the no-knock warrant, as if you guys just rammed her front door, and that's why you opened fire. And then there's also the body cam footage, which you just alluded to a couple of moments ago, in regards to Kenneth Walker, her boyfriend, saying that Breonna was the one who opened fire when in fact it was him, and that's all recorded. So there's evidence that he did lie as well when they were trying to talk to him and trying to see what happened here and where the confusion was. And so that's all public now. But again, the media is not putting that out there. I wanted to ask you, John, because, several of your former colleagues have all been prosecuted. You haven't been prosecuted, though. They didn't really go after you. Do you think that they didn't go after you because you were shot that day?
Well, saying they didn't go after me is one thing. Saying they didn't have anything to go after me on is different. So
Yeah.
we run their investigation for about 2 years. They've done several warrants on my Google accounts, my Apple accounts, our social media. They scoured everything, our phones. They were looking for anything they could find. They turned over every rock. At the end of the day, I was sitting in a meeting prior to the grand jury testimony that I was ordered to by a judge, with the prosecutors from DC, and they're sitting in there, the DOJ, and at the end of it, he was like, "Look, we're not going after you. You know, we've done our due diligence on you, and you seem like a decent cop, a good guy." And I'm sitting back thinking, well, you all went totally out of the parameters of this investigation to go after everybody on this case just to try to find some smear tactic or something outside of the bounds that they could bring in so they could get their chunk of flesh. So now dealing with the federal government and being on the other side of investigations, I can understand why there's a mistrust in government. One I didn't have prior to this as much, but now once that curtain's been kind of pulled back. So yes, they did look for anything to come after us. Fortunately, they didn't find anything, because those of us on scene, we were hired labor. We were like, hey, can y'all come help? Sure, we'll show up and help. We showed up and helped. We just got in a bad situation. So the federal government did try to come after us. Fortunately, they didn't find anything. And the things they're going after, like Brett, for is just unbelievable. Third trial coming up on the same charge, and they can't get him, but they're continuing to try.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's what lawfare is all about, because they just want their results in the end. And they'll find any jury or find any judge to grant whatever they want at this point. And then they've really proven just that. It's heartbreaking, but we know what they're doing, and it's not what should be taking place. It's not our justice system. I want to remind our audience again that you are the author of the book 12 Seconds in the Dark, a police officer's firsthand count of the Breonna Taylor raid. Again, folks, that book is available on Amazon. If you're looking to dig into the details of what took place that day, kind of debunk the mainstream narrative that was pushed, this is a good read, and I highly recommend you go over there and grab yourself a copy. Sergeant John Mattingly, as always, thank you for joining me. I greatly appreciate it.
Thanks, Breanna.
That segment wasn't brought to you by any corrupt corporations. It was brought to you by, well, you, the viewers. This show, obviously, being that I'm an independent journalist, literally relies on you at home. So if you'd like to keep us up and running, the best platform to do so is over at supportbree.com. That's where you can make a one-time donation or become a monthly donor, and you get to pick that dollar amount. So head on over to supportbree.com. If you're enjoying this content and you want to keep us on, that is the best platform to do so.